All right, well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. I think we have a really exciting lecture and two speakers that are going to really talk on an interesting topic related to the Chicago School of Architecture. And the way we're going to do this is Richard is going to talk first, and I'm going to introduce him, and then I'll also introduce Suzanne, who will speak for a few minutes after Richard is done. And then we'll sort of sit down in the front and we'll have a little bit of a discussion dialogue, take questions that you might have, and try, because both speakers, I think, are going to have kind of a complementary speech or whatever that on this topic. This is the epidemiology of the Chicago School of Architecture. And starting is going to be Richard Condit. He's a PhD biologist with broad research interests on populations and communities in both marine and forest ecosystems. He studied at the University of Illinois and has received his PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz. And he's held positions as a research scientist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Princeton, and was at the Smithsonian Institution in Panama for 25 years. He's published over 200 scientific articles, mostly on forest trees, marine mammals, and wrote a book on the trees of Panama and Costa Rica. He has done field research in Ecuador, Cameroon, Colombia, and studied seal colonies in California. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought this was about architecture. Well, he's also the son of Carl Condit, the author of the Chicago School of Architecture, which is, you know, kind of like a Bible to architectural historians and aficionados of Chicago architecture. And since he retired from the Smithsonian, Richard's been, you know, really got a kind of an interest in his father's work. And he's been documenting the buildings of the Chicago School that his father studied and wrote about, and kind of applying his scientific knowledge and epidemiology to the buildings, and you know which ones have survived and which ones have flourished and survived, or which ones were lost. So I think it's going to be a really kind of a fascinating take on architectural history. And then we'll have Suzanne German. Suzanne has been with Landmarks Illinois since 2004, first as the Director of Grants and Easements, and is now the Director of Reinvestment. She is responsible for managing Landmarks Illinois' grants program, the preservation easement program, and the reinvestment program. She also supervises the Illinois Restoration Services Directory. Previous to Landmarks Illinois, she was a preservation planner for Lake Forest and also a historian at a local architecture firm. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Art History and Photography from the State University of New York at New Platts, and a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the School of the Art Institute here in Chicago. And Suzanne and I have known each other for many years, probably about the time you started. I was on that grant or preservation easement fund committee. So we've known each other many, many years, so I'm really looking forward to her comments as well. So without further ado, I introduce Richard Condit.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Doug. Thanks to the UTRF and Hyde and Laura for inviting me to this remarkable interior, fabulous space, and it's an honor to lecture here. So, yeah, my father was Carl W. Condit, and he was a architectural historian and a professor at Northwestern University. And I'm going to lecture to you this evening about the current status. I'm going to follow up buildings that he wrote about in these two books that you and Doug just mentioned one, the one on the left. And many of you may have read these books, might be familiar with them, but perhaps some of you have not. I'll give you a little bit more background about what Carl W. Condit did. He wrote many books broadly about building art in America, American structural design. He wrote about urban planning and urban development. He wrote about New York, Cincinnati, besides Chicago. He often wrote about railroads. But his best-known book is this one that Doug just introduced, the one on the left, the Chicago School of Architecture, which is still selling well enough for me to get some royalties, my brother and I. And if you looked at his entire bibliography, though, you'll also, there's two other books. I'm pointing with my finger. That's the technology here for pointing. You see the two at the bottom. I can use this thing too. There's two books he wrote about Chicago. There was a 1952 book, The Rise of the Skyscraper. That was the initial edition of the Chicago School of Architecture. They're the same book, except the later book was expanded. And there's a later book, that covered Chicago after 1974. But I'm focusing on these two books here. These are the books in which he documented the invention of the skyscraper in Chicago during the 1880s. And using the name, the Chicago School of Architecture followed the styles in commercial buildings in Chicago through that. Up at the top left, it says 1875, the first year, through this book covering up to 1929. So he wrote through that period, which is a period of historical, let's say the historical landmarks in Chicago and the development of the early buildings, skyscrapers. And so just remember, you all probably know the Chicago School. There's no school. It's now the name of one of the styles of architecture. I come across it in, architectural guidebooks that were just written a few years ago in San Diego or Louisville, and they'll, this one's Art Deco and that one's Chicago School. So it's a term that's used to describe one particular style. So my father's, he was responsible for, what we call landmarks now, or what the buildings that he was writing about in these books. And he was also involved with the preservation movement, which was starting as it started in the 60s or even the 50s, but the 60s and the 70s. And he testified on the landmark committee hearings to preserve buildings that he had been studying so much. So here's a picture of him at one of the landmarks that he wrote about, and that's my mother, Isabel Campbell. She was a Campbell, Isabel Campbell Condit. And my goal now is to take the buildings that he wrote about, the Condit important buildings, and track them down now. Where are they now? How many are still there? How many of them are what we call landmarks? How many have been demolished? So when I was a kid growing up in Morton Grove, I heard a lot of my father on his preference for buildings. I lived in a house. This is the house in Morton Grove. It was a prairie school-like horizontal house with big windows. And it really stood out in mundane brick houses of the suburbs around Morton Grove. And for me as a kid, that was just an embarrassment because my friends made fun of it, and we didn't have a basement. So in tornadoes, we had to go somewhere else. And, over dinner conversation, I learned his analysis and his opinions, and he was really opinionated about buildings. I learned that early on. So there was a time when I was a kid when I believed that every skyscraper built in the 1960s was vacuous. That was one of his favorite words. But in my day-to-day life as a kid, I was more familiar with his fascination with railroads because he took my brothers and I, and that's my younger brother Ken, next to me. He would take us to see trains all the time, often at the Glenview station on the Milwaukee line, which wasn't far from where we lived. And my brother Steve, my older brother Steve, also came, and Steve ended up working for the railroad. And at some point, I found these drawings and realized that my father's fascination with railroads went back to when he was a kid. He did these intricate detailed line drawings, pencil drawings of steam locomotives. There's about 15 of them that I know. And they say 1929 there in the lower corner, so he did it when he was 15 years old. But he took this childhood fascination with railroads, and it became part of his career because he wrote about railroad transportation, the transportation networks, not the, say, the train engines, though. And that was part of his research on cities and the development of cities. But he was an engineer by training, which many people may not realize if they've read his book. He studied engineering at Purdue University. That was his undergraduate degree. And I came to learn later that his fascination with big buildings, which spilled over into big bridges, were both stemming from an interest in the engineering, the problems of building big structures that stood up. And I remember some other childhood stories when we went on a driving trip to New York. One year we took a side trip up in northern Pennsylvania to see that bridge on the left, the railroad bridge. And I remember when I was very little seeing Mackinac Bridge, and around that time I was learning regularly from my father on the completion of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York, which was really interesting to him, and that was in the mid-60s. But part of his engineering interest that went part and parcel with math and science. He taught math during World War II, and he at Northwestern University, and he founded a program in the history of science, and then he taught history of science for 30 years. So other, lunchtime conversations covered Archimedes and Priestley and Newton's law of cooling, for example. And so when I became a scientist, I felt like I was following in my father's footsteps just as much as if I had studied buildings or bridges. And I was following in his fascination in rigorous analysis of complicated questions. So, and the three of us, there were three brothers. My older brother worked for the railroad. My younger brother became an engineer, and I became a scientist. And I thought we were just exactly covering my dad's interests. We all followed things he was interested in. But across the three of us, we didn't manage to span the breadth of his interest because none of us worked on buildings or architecture. And by the way, his PhD was in literature, and none of us were close to literature. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some background in the creatures, the research that I've been doing in biology. And this is going to be a lead-in to how I deal with the question about inventory and state of my father's buildings, so the buildings that he wrote about. And much of my career has been spent on two kinds of research. These strange-looking things on the left, those are elephant seals. That's a beach in California. And then I've spent many years, I lived in Panama, did research on tree species, especially in Panama, but also in especially tropical forests and other parts of the world. And I loved being close to these animals and these plants and getting to know them, learning to identify the trees. As Doug said, I wrote a book about tree identification and understanding these seals up close. I'm about 20 feet from those animals when I took the picture. But when I was a grad student and a young scientist, I quickly gravitated to the idea of, the population level. So I began to think about not just these individual organisms, but groups of organisms and population. So I illustrate this with a couple pictures. They're both taken from up above. They're taken from the air. The left is a drone picture of those same seals on a beach in California. And what I've done with this picture, I've marked, if you look closely, every single one of the animals has a little colored spot on it. And so I can count them all and I know where they all are. So I'm following every individual. And the one on the right is a very parallel picture. I didn't really see that till I was setting this up. This is a picture from above. It's a satellite picture of an island in the Panama Canal called Barrow, Colorado. There's a ship up there. That's a ship in the Panama Canal right up there. And I've been, it's exactly the same. Inside that rectangle, that white rectangle, every single tree is marked, just like these seals are. Keep track of every single individual. And by keeping track of all the individuals, a main goal is to find out how long they live, which ones die. And I'll show you one example. This is a female of the elephant seal, and she's 22 years old. So she's the oldest elephant seal I've ever seen. The females get a little gray on the head when they get old. We know that for sure. We know where she was born. We know where she was seen throughout her life. We tracked her through her entire life. And for these many individual trees and seals that I've followed, this allows me to ask questions about what traits did she have that helped her survive, and what are traits that do the opposite, that are associated with short lifetime or animals that die when they're young. So if you keep in mind that perspective, which I've just described to you, I'm going to explain how I started looking at my father's buildings. And so this began, it was 8 years ago, and Sue and I were not living in Chicago. We were living in California, but we came to visit. And on one of my visits, it dawned on me, well, here was a nice idea. I was going to take my father's book, and I'd go down to the Loop, and I'd walk around, and I'd find the buildings that he wrote about, and I'd read about what he wrote, and understand his description while I was looking at the building. Seemed like a great idea, and for a moment I thought I'd just walk down with the book and I'd pull out the book and I'd look, and then I realized, well, it was going to take me a while to find the buildings that he wrote a lot about, and then figure out where they were, whether I was in the right place, and then they might have been torn down already. And I knew then, because he had been involved in the preservation and the landmark committee hearings for a long time, of course I knew that buildings he had been writing about were being torn down. So there was every likelihood that many of the buildings that I found in the book wouldn't be there anymore. And I really wasn't sure at the time how many were going to be there. Was it going to be almost none, or were there going to be most of them there? I didn't know. So I was, literally I was sitting at a desk leafing through that book that Doug had, scanning through, trying to find, okay, where's a building that he's been, a page or 2 pages writing about, something I could see a lot about the building. And then when I found that building, I had to find, okay, where is that building? He was very clear about whether the buildings were standing then. So he would say, well, this building was demolished in 1949. Okay, well, I got to go on to the next one. So I was flailing a little bit, skimming the book, trying to figure out if I could find a building or a group of buildings that I could go visit. And then, while skimming through the book, I noticed an index. And in the index, there's just one index in the book, but under the B's, there's a building entry. And that building entry has over 4 pages of sub-entries, re-alphabetized under the building entry. So I scanned over that, and I realized that my father had created a complete inventory of all the buildings in the Chicago School of Architecture book. He had already done it. So at this point, you're supposed to imagine there was like a light bulb that went on over my head. He did the inventory of every building. This is what I do with my career. I know exactly how to handle that information. So I had an inventory of all the buildings. I create big databases like this all the time. And so when I tell you that there's 378 entries in the building, under the building heading in the index, that means there are 378. And when I set up this kind of data, I say, well, let's associate information with those entries. What are the buildings that those entries link to? Where were those buildings? And how much did my father write about it? Now I could go jump back to the text for each one of them, because there's a page number. That's what an index is for, after all. And I could go check and see, well, how much did he write about every one of these buildings? So you might say right off, well, 378 entries, 316 buildings. Some of the buildings have more than one name, so they appeared more than once in the index. There's a few other oddities that weren't really buildings. And then he mentions the Parthenon and Mount Vernon and Crystal Palace in London as introductions to buildings in Chicago. So not all the buildings are in Chicago. And then this question, I wanted to know which were still there. So the big question now is which of those buildings are still standing? And my father, as I say, he was clear. He used the past tense very consistently versus the present tense about a building he was describing. Was it there when he was writing about it or not? That was very clear. He usually gave the demolition date. He didn't always. But then, as I said, well, I knew they were being torn down, so I had to do more work to to find out what had happened since 1964. So then, okay, well, there's a second book now, and then to repeat all that, there's also an index, there's a building entry, there are 311 entries, and there are 230 buildings in Chicago. That's the book I call Chicago 1910, though. The second of the two books I mentioned. But I quickly came across a quandary that just by scanning through the very first few times in the index, this was every single building that he mentioned in the text, and some of those buildings he wasn't even describing. He wasn't telling me any information at all. They just appeared in a phrase because they were next to another building, for example. And so in the process of I was counting up how much text he wrote about everyone, so I have an estimate of how much text, how many pages or paragraphs or sentences. But I came up with a break point, a cutoff that when he wrote 2 sentences or more, he was telling me something about the building. Nearly always that meant I learned who the architect was, when it was built, maybe something about the structure or the facade. And I call those primary buildings. Some of them just because they had a photo. There's a few cases where he said very little, but there's a photo. And then, you know, the 85 secondary buildings, they're buildings that he said in passing. So I don't, in a sense, I don't want to count them. If I had started, I would have not included those. And if I didn't have this index, this project maybe never would have happened, for one thing. If it had happened, it would have meant reading the entire book very slowly over and over again, checking off buildings. So you see, it wouldn't have happened. But when I was presented with this inventory, for the simple idea of walk down the street one day just to read about 3 or 4 buildings, I now had this entire list, and I could answer the question not only which are the ones of the 4 I wanted to see were standing, but every single one which were standing. So I now had, there's 291 primary buildings in this list here, which I can call the ones that Condit, Carl W. Condit, thought were the more important buildings in Chicago. But, and so now, here's an outline. This is what academics do. This will help when Alice gives you a quiz in the next lecture, if you get a hold of this. I'll give out the notes, the course notes. So what I've told you here, in these, I have 3 different headings here. That there's 2 books, and I want to know what are the buildings included. I've just told you that I can find out every single one. And how much is written about each one, I can look it up. I was able to look it up fairly quickly. And now this leads to the question, the 3rd line down. How many are still standing? It's just a one question with one answer. And then I'll go on and ask this question. It's going to lead me to some obvious questions, follow-up questions about which are the buildings that are still standing. And also I'll come to that point and then close about why some are standing and some are not. So, Sue said this. Here's the primary buildings. I just came up with 291 primary Condit buildings, the ones he wrote about in these 2 very important books. Are there any Frank Lloyd Wright buildings? We're in this important Frank Lloyd Wright building. So sure enough, there is. There's one. And you might say one Frank Lloyd Wright building. This building's in it, but it doesn't count as primary because he only wrote a sentence about it. But he liked this apartment complex here. He liked the facade. He thought it was a great example of Frank Lloyd Wright. He has a good word about Frank Lloyd Wright, but he I don't remember the word, majestic or something. But so my quiz is, do any of you know what this is? Do I have experts here who can tell me what it is? Somebody does. Who said that? Yeah, somebody does. Okay, it's a good group. We've got to come up with harder questions. Yeah, these are the Francis Apartments. They're on the south side, 4300 something. And they were torn down in 1971, I think. They were torn down. He saw these. They were standing when he wrote about them, but they were torn down in the 70s. But what about the ones that I have a way of quantifying now? The ones he really thought were important are the ones that he wrote the most about. There's 7 buildings in that first book, the Chicago School of Architecture, that he wrote 3 pages or more about. He wrote 9 pages about the auditorium and 7 pages about home insurance. Now, it sounds like there's at least one expert here, and Keith's here, so there's 2, not counting the ones in the front. So the experts know every one of these buildings. These are the most important, some of the most important buildings in Chicago. There's the year they were built, 1880s, one of them in 1903, the Sullivan, the Carson Perry Scott store, which you know well. And then there's the year they're demolished, so you can tell then the 3 of them don't have a year. Those are the 3 that are standing. So those 3, guessing most of you have seen those buildings. You're familiar with that Sullivan, the Carson Perry Scott store, the Monadnock, and the auditorium. You've probably heard about the home insurance building, the first skyscraper in the world. And these, the Garrick Theater, I'll say more about that later because my dad was very fond of the Garrick Theater. Here's a lovely picture, if you can. So that picture is the last building, the Masonic Temple. So that building was 21 stories. And the previous speaker here had a slide with all the he might, that might have been one of it. There may have been a moment when it was the tallest building in the world. This is a picture from Scientific American. It's a 1894 Scientific American article where they've put out the Masonic Temple next to 4 of the tallest structures in the United States, which you probably know what most of them are. That's Trinity Church or Temple, the one in Manhattan, Trinity. So there's Masonic Temple, taller than the Capitol building, etc. And then there's 16 other buildings he wrote 2 pages about. You can just glance down the list. If you do this, if you look down demolition, you can see which ones are standing. When you look at those, you'll recognize them. Many of you, there's the Rookery and the Manhattan Marquette. Again, very familiar, well-known landmarks of Chicago that my father wrote about in 1964. Then another sort of early idea of what I'm about to tell you. Some of the demolition dates. The Rand McNally building, one of those Rand McNally buildings was torn down in 1911. The Tacoma building, which was a really important early skyscraper, was torn down in 1929. My father moved here in the 1940s. There is a series of very early important buildings that were long gone by the time he moved here. So some of these buildings were torn down long ago. So I could make this a quiz, but I bet many of you can name these. So there's 3 of the important ones on the top that are still there. You have nowadays, if it's a color picture, you can tell it's in the present day. But if it's black and white, it's an old picture. Does anyone know what the bottom one was, the black and white one? That's the, nobody knows that. Yeah, that's it. It's the music hall. 1879. It was torn down in 1901, so it didn't even barely made it out of into the 20th century. A forerunner to the Opera House. I think you guys know that better. That's the Carson Peary Scott, and then the Old Colony Building, and the Monadnock Building, and the Fisher Building's also in there. One that I know my dad testified about preservation of the Fisher Building. So then I put out, because now I can tell there's experts here, so maybe this will be useful. I mentioned that there's some I haven't been able to track down details. So here's a list of some of the buildings I know least about. In most of them, the one question is, if you look at the demolition on the far right, there's uncertainty. I'm not sure when they were torn down. They're gone now, but I'm not sure when it happened. Some of them are really long. So the second one on the line, that's the Omaha Apartments. I don't remember where they were. They were done by the Pond brothers. And my father says they were built in 1893. I can tell they were demolished by 1963, but I have no idea when. I haven't been able to find a record. There's a record out there somewhere. The top one, though, this is one that was done by Purcell and Elmsley. There was a factory, this International Leather and Belting Company factory. My father doesn't give an address. I don't know where it was. I'm not even sure it's Chicago. Maybe it wasn't Chicago. And I'm sure it's torn down, but I don't know for sure. And I know there's a book about Elmsley, which I haven't been able to get a hold of a copy. So I can find that one. So if you see any names here, then someone, and I mentioned this, I had this in my slide in earlier talks, and Keith Bringy was there, and there was this Garden City plating factory, and Keith helped me find that, so now I know where it's still standing. And a woman named Judith Griffith, she came to one of my talks, and there was a Langdon Apartments on this list, and Judith knew that. She sent me a map. There's a plan of exactly where they were, and she knew when they were torn down. So this little picture there at the lower right, does anyone know what that is? This is a hard one. It's one of the ones on the list. So I got this, it's the Sells Schwab factory, and I couldn't find that for a while. I didn't know where it was, so I couldn't tell. Wasn't sure whether it was still there. And then I came across a picture from the guy who took pictures of all the Sullivan buildings. Sorry, Dick Nickel. My dad called him Dick Nickel. That's what he always said. So he has a picture of this, and now I know where it is, and I know it's not there anymore, but I'm not sure when it was torn down. So just come by later and tell me if you recognize any. So then there's the later book, the book from 1910 to 1930. There's another set of buildings. These are now mostly built in the 1920s. These are ones that he thought were very important. They're the follow-up group, his second book. A lot of these are the Art Deco ones that Keith wrote about. A bunch of buildings that you know very well in Chicago, the Opera House and the Daily News, the aquarium and the museums and the planetarium, Wrigley Building. Lots that you'd expect to be there. He wrote about them in 1972. So then I have another quiz. So there's no column for demolition here. That saved a lot of space because all but one are still standing. So does anyone want to guess which one of these is now torn down? All right, you guys are good. Who said that, Keith? Oh, yeah, so the Capitol Theater. You know that place. So it was torn down in 1985, and it was on the far south side, and it was a theater that, my father has a whole section on theaters built in the 1920s, these theaters built all over the city, and the Capitol Theater was one he was really taken with. And yeah, unfortunately it was torn down. There's a couple others here that maybe you don't all know. So then, what do you call the one on the top right? You familiar with this one? You know what it is? Yeah, that's right. So that's what my father called it, the American Furniture Mart. So, but it's part of Northwestern now, so I don't think anyone calls it that anymore. He had a long discussion of a couple pages on the structure. It's a really huge, long building back from the lake with a giant steel frame. And then the one on the top left, now here's an interesting one many of you know what this is. This is what the Central Manufacturing District. So that's still there. And that was interesting. It's not just one building, but it's a whole district. And my father was very interested in organizing this manufacturing district on the south side. It's Pershing, but it's a big area. It has a whole bunch of buildings that look just the same, exactly the same. And you can tell from this picture that most of them, all of them, are derelict. And I know that there are discussions of preserving them, but I don't think anyone's there's no official plan yet. Is that right? Do you know? So there's hope of preserving many of these buildings. There's a whole bunch of them, but the fear is that they're going to be torn down one by one. They're not being used, and someone will come in and take out one of them. There's the theater on the bottom. That's the Capitol Theater. It was on Halsted, way on the south side, 7900 South. One of the pictures of the facades I found, look, it says Liston Patterson, so that gives you an idea what year that picture was taken. So there's the outline again. So here's the question I've told you. Here's the most important buildings he wrote about. Clearly you recognize many of them. They are what we call landmarks now. He was telling you that you should call them landmarks 60 years ago. So how many are there? Well, here's one answer from the first book published in 1964. I said there was 185. If you're really detail oriented, you'll remember I said 186 primary buildings, but one of those, that factory, I don't know what happened to it, so it's not counted in here. So 185 buildings. I know for sure what happened to those, and 102 have been demolished. 83 are still standing. You got a hint of all that already because I've shown you those tables where, somewhere around half of them have been torn down and half are still standing. So that fraction there, that number, 44.9%, that's 83 divided by 185. So I'll have a few tables like this to look at survival rates, and they'll all look the same calculation. How many buildings do you start with under a column called total? How many are still there? How many are demolished? Extant plus demolished has to add up to total, and then the percent survival is the percent that are extant. So one question that came up right away, because I could tell, as I said, whether my father knew the building, whether it was standing in 64. Oh, I'll give you a rate here. There's like a survival rate that you can use for buildings. That comes out to 7% per decade. So 7% of the buildings in this group were torn down every decade. Well, if I split it up into two, how many were still there when my father wrote? I'll have a little water now, while you figure out if you understand what this means. So when he wrote in 1964, 123 were still standing. So if you just read across the first row, it all means the same thing, and 67% of them, almost exactly 2/3, were still standing. But since then, 40 more have been demolished. 62 had been demolished by 1964, 40 more after that. If you read the second row, that means as of 1964, there were 123 standing. That's now the proper sample to start with. All those ones that were extant in 64 become the sample in that year. And since 83 of them survived till now, that comes out again to 2/3. So an interesting observation is that it's about 60 years, both periods of time. Well, a little bit more. He was writing about many buildings in the 1890s, 70 years. Pretty similar periods of time, very similar. So the rate of demolition has been about the same after as before. It's not exactly what I expected. I thought maybe more would be protected. But here's a survivorship curve. I'm going to walk you through a survivorship curve. You're going to learn what a survivorship curve is. If you haven't seen it, this is a way epidemiologists, biologists illustrate survival through time. So this is just a question of document year by year. There's 8 decades across the horizontal axis. And each time, I'm going to put the number of buildings that are still there. And this is a group that I'm starting with 147, not the entire group, just 147. And they're the ones that were already there by 1910. So all the buildings that were finished before 1910. He had a whole chapter in the first book, The Chicago School of Architecture, on the late modern Chicago school. He had Mies van der Rohe and Morowings and Merrill. So there's quite a few buildings in that book, although it's about an early period, it says on the cover. He has a chapter on later buildings. So if I include only ones that were built before 1910, it's 147. And by 1910, there were 122 of them left. So, and you see 25 were demolished. So by 1910, already this group, 25 were already gone by 1930. Among those, the Montauk, I mentioned that earlier, one of his really important buildings torn down before 1930. And this is the Chamber of Commerce, another of the very early interesting skyscrapers, but torn down before 1930. So then, after 1930, I'll go through 10 years. There were 8 more demolished in the 1930s. So you go from 122 to 114. That's the survivorship curve. Again, a couple really interesting buildings. They were gone before my father could have seen them. This is the Home Insurance, the first skyscraper in the world. And then this one that the Marshall Field that Richardson did that Sullivan loved. And that's the one that the Italian, that they was sort of copied from the, Sullivan from the Italian castle. So these were both torn down in the 1930s. The 1940s, now there's a World War, 5 were demolished. Still some important buildings. I'll give a couple here. That's the Great Northern Hotel. That is the Ashland Block. They're both Burnham and Root. I can read that off the tiny text there. These are from my father's book. It's a classic Chicago school, very similar looking buildings. Almost confused them, I think, right? Both torn down in the 1940s. 1950s, 8 were demolished. So here's 30 years have gone by, 1930, well, 20 years, 1930 to 1960, 3 decades, 30 years. Kind of a steady rate. They're going down to 5, 7, 8 per decade. So what happens in the 1960s? You've read about this probably. So now suddenly 1960s, 24 of the buildings were torn down. So now it's gone from 100 down to 76. 1960s, I'll mention a little bit later. What's some of these buildings? There's that Hyde Park Hotel. This is a funny little building, the Edison store in the Loop, I think. This is one my father thought was a really important skyscraper. That's Halliburton Roach, right? The Republic building. And then the Garrick Theater. So the Garrick Theater was torn down. The Sullivan Garrick Theater, I'll come back to that again later, torn down in 1961. So after the 60s, I'm going to just jump. There were 9 demolished in the 70s, 4 more in the 80s, 6 in the 90s, and then the last 2, no more have been demolished since these 2. So what were these 2? The last 2 that he wrote about. One of them was this building called the Dexter building. Now this was just unfortunate because at this, just before a big fire, they decided they'd restore and preserve this building, right? Then there was a really bad fire and they had to tear it down. And then another one was my father knew this as a chocolate factory. That's sort of funny. It's the Bunn Brothers Chocolate Factory. And here's a sort of recent picture. You can tell in the 2000s, and it's derelict, but then it was torn down in 2010, and they built a school there. There's a second book. I'll just remind you, because that was the first book. I'm just going to give you the answer in two answers again. These buildings were built, remember, mostly after 1920, or nearly all after 1910. How many are still standing in 2021? There's 88 still standing now. 88 out of 105. So that's 84%. A lot more still standing from the earlier group I gave you. That turns out to be 2% per decade. I gave you 7% before. And when my father wrote about them in 1972, 100 of them were still standing. So only 5 have been torn down by 1972. And since then, 12 more were torn down. So they actually got torn down a little bit faster after 1972. So I have what I noticed very quickly tallying these numbers is that there were early buildings that had lower survival rates. There are not as many of those around still. That's what I've shown you so far. So I'm going to follow up on that more precisely in a next table of numbers, and then pose a more rigorous question about what that means for the different buildings. And use that survivorship curve again to pose that question. So I'm going to take all the buildings that he wrote about in two books, all the primary buildings, I call them. It's about 290, and I give you the same row of numbers, but now depending on when the buildings were built. So I'm going to start with the 1880s, and my father wrote about 34 buildings, so it's very early skyscrapers. Only 4 of them are still standing. That includes the Rookery and the Auditorium. And the one called the Jewelry Building and is still standing. So nearly all of them are gone. That percentage is only 12% are still standing. Of those buildings built in the 1990s, he wrote about 54. 22 are still standing. It jumps up quite a bit. The percentage is 41%. 1900s, 43 buildings now. More than half of them are still here now. And then once you get to the 1910s and 1920s, 85%. Most of the buildings are still here. So there's a real sharp change. The real older buildings are not many left. So I'm going to push this question a little bit because what I thought immediately, in fact, what I thought the explanation for this was, which maybe you're thinking, I hope you're thinking, well, of course, they're older buildings. You never see as many old things. They have longer to go, so they tend to die. So I'm going to explain precisely what I mean by that. So I'm going to make a careful comparison to answer the question about how those old buildings have fared compared to the newer ones. So I'm going to start this by showing a survivorship curve, the same kind of curve I already showed you for buildings. But these are people, so this is used all the time in animal populations. Survivorship curve. You draw across the x-axis, the horizontal axis, time. It's just years, and you take groups of humans. I'm going to take all the humans that were born in 1950, exactly 1950. Call that a cohort. This information is really easy to get. You can get every single cohort back to about 1910 and how long they live very readily from big databases online. And then a second group, a younger group, a group that was born in 1970. They're like the more recent buildings. And then I asked the question, how many are still there in 2010? It's easy if I stop in 2010 when all the data are there. And so you immediately say, well, of course, there's fewer people born from 1950 around because they're 60 years old. So of course there's fewer 60-year-olds than there are 40-year-olds. We all know that. We all expect that. That's what you just see in these curves. So the difference is the exact numbers. There's a 94.6. 95% of the people born in 1970 were still alive in 2010. But only 84% of the people born in 1950. They had longer to go. I'm not really learning anything from that comparison, right? That's the issue. If I show you the 1880 buildings, the 8 buildings built in the 1880s aren't around. It's just because it's been longer for them. So the right way to do it, you take exactly those numbers, and this will be obvious to you once I explain it. I'm going to take the same two groups, but instead of putting year along that horizontal axis, I put age. So I'm going to start them all off at age 0 when they're born and ask how many were still alive 40 years later. Now it's a good comparison. It's a fair comparison. What percentage of the people born in 1950 lived to age 40? What percentage of the people born in 1970? The difference is almost gone now. 94.6, that's exactly the same number as the previous one. I haven't changed anything. It's still 40 years in the future. But for the others, I stopped at 40 and said it was 92.5. The difference almost disappeared, but there's a little difference. But now we have a meaningful difference. Now I know for sure, and we know this very well, right? We're all living longer. I tell you all the time, the lifespan is getting longer. People born in 1970 had a slightly higher chance of making it to age 40 than those born in 1950. But it's now a good comparison. You can answer the question. So I'm going to do exactly the same curve for buildings. Same idea. I'm going to take 4 cohorts when the buildings were born. The buildings in red, there's a red line, just like the one on the previous. It's going to follow the percentage still standing of the buildings that were built in the 1880s. And then there's a green line, 1890s, blue line, 1900s, black line for everything later than 1910. So now they're all aligned at 0, where 0 is the birth year for each of these buildings. And now any difference left is a real difference between them. So now I look at this and I say, yeah, those 1880s buildings really suffered. They had a shorter lifespan, and that's because the red curve comes way down. So let's say at 50 years out, so for those buildings it's the 1930s, but for the top ones, 1910, 50 years out is the 1960s. But 50 years out, they were already down to 60%. Many of them were already demolished. Whereas the very top line, almost nearly all were still there 50 years out. And the 2 lines fall right in the middle, so the older the building, if you go all the way out to 80 years, I can put numbers in one table now. So I imagine you just draw a straight line at 80 and you read off where they are, and this is what you get. If I asked the percentage were alive 80 years in the future, what percentage lasted 80 years? For those very early buildings that my father wrote about, it's only 31%. But then it gets up nearly 90% for the most recent buildings. So there's a really big difference, and it's a true difference that has to do, apparently, with when they were built. That's all I've told you so far. It's not just that they've been around longer, but something really was hard for them, these buildings, because they started dying off, they were just demolished, from age 30 to 40, much faster than the other groups. Those are buildings torn down in the 1930s, right? Home insurance, the Marshall Field store. So I'm going to come back to the decade of the 1960s again and point out now in these graphs, and I already showed you how in the one graph it just had all the buildings together. During the 1960s, there was a lot of buildings torn down. But these buildings, because they started in different years, they encountered the 1960s at different ages. So the earliest group, the 1880s, didn't encounter the 1960s till they were past 70. Whereas, say, the blue ones, they were built in the 1900s, they encountered the 1960s when they were in their 50s. So the 1960s were like this epidemic that swept through Chicago buildings, and it killed a lot of buildings, and it did it regardless of age. So there's this drop in both the blue, the green, and the red curves. Not so much in the top one, the late buildings, but all the buildings that were there, the red ones were already way behind. They were suffering from just background demolition, but they all reached the 1960s and all had more demolition. So I'm now talking because this is the way epidemiologists would talk about diseases sweeping through a population which affected all ages at the same regardless. So I'm going to now pull out a couple quotes about the 1960s. This is Sharon Ira. She was a student of my father's, and then in 2008 she wrote a sort of memoriam about my father's work. She wrote a summary of his work. And she pointed out that these catalysts. One reason, he never told me, I never learned this, but a reason that he decided to redo his book on the Chicago School of Architecture was because of all the buildings he saw being torn down. And she says 52 to 64. I think it really started in the late 50s. But then what did my father say about, he's speaking about 1961. And he often didn't mince words. What kind of year was it? It was a tragic year. An orgy of destruction. And what about the Garrick Theater? It was torn down? No, it was a barbarous act of vandalism. This is out of his third book. So, you know, he's pretty clear about our mayor then and the mayor's decision to tear down some of these buildings. But, you know, I already showed you the Republic building, which he mentions here, and the Garrick Theater. He also mentions the Cable and the Majestic Hotel. But then after that, he finished the book, and then, you know, some of these buildings that he thought important, that this is the first lighter building, the Rothschild, the Sears Roebuck factory, were torn down after 1970s. And the one that's probably the one of the most shocking is this the stock exchange building, which seemed to be a perfectly good building, and it was torn down in 1972. And that was when I was alive and living at home and was very aware of this happening. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I think hopefully leading into what Suzanne will say about preservation. So I'm going to plant this word obsolescence as a sort of contrast to preservation. And state the facts, so, like, just to get the facts straight, 44% of the buildings that he wrote about in 1964 are still standing. So more than half of them are gone. It's very clear that the earliest buildings built in 1880, some of the very earliest skyscrapers, had very low survival, and that started in the 1930s, long ago. But since 1910, buildings have had high survival, and most are still there. So after 1910, and now I'm going to introduce the idea of the technologies that my father wrote a lot about, and then I spent time talking with Tom Leslie about, because Tom Leslie's book very describes these technologies in great detail. And Tom Leslie's the one who gave me the word obsolescence, I think, when we talked about this. So during the 1890s, the steel skeleton, which was called Chicago construction, took over and became the only way to build skyscrapers at the time. And it replaced the old masonry buildings, and the masonry buildings, in order to be a big building, they had to have enormous walls. And as Leslie pointed out to me, these walls were so big that they just took up space. It was very difficult to build a narrow building and tall and masonry walls. There were other technologies which were important. Really, Leslie's book is very good about it. Elevators and glass. And those 1880s buildings, many of them were masonry, and they were really out of date. They were very difficult to use, and so they weren't considered as valuable. But the flip side of that is buildings that are obsolescent, very early buildings, it might be hard to preserve, are ones built after 1910, they're all viable. Most of them are still standing, a few are not. The technology was good enough by 1910 that the buildings are perfectly viable. So as I mentioned already, my father was early in working on these experts. He was writing about it just as he's expanded, but then I've noticed that even as these preservation efforts became more crystallized and during the 1960s, it still took a while. There were still buildings being torn down in the 1970s, but now buildings that he wrote about are landmarks that no one would dream of tearing down, I think. So, and those are some of them here, and the experts obviously will be able to identify these. These are all among those very top ones that the Rookery, the Reliance Building, the Manhattan Building, of course the auditorium, and the second lighter store. Now, my goal starting this was to locate the buildings and then go read about them. So if you want to do that, I've now set up a map. These maps are online, and the simplest way to find them is to do a Google search for that interactive maps of buildings of the Chicago School. And in those maps, you'll see there's a map with every single building, and they're clearly marked by color, whether they're standing or not. And if you click on them, you'll see the page number in the book. So you can go find them quickly and easily now and know whether they're standing. All right, thank you. So I'll pass this on to Doug and Suzanne.
Cool. Many of you know, some of you know, my husband is an epidemiologist. So when I was asked to join this conversation, I was really intrigued. One of my first conversations with my husband was about the connection between epidemiology and historic preservation. We never looked at it on the per building level like this, but I'm well versed in all of those graphs that you were showing, mostly in how they address pandemics. But thank you for having me tonight. This is fun. I am Suzanne German. I'm the director of grants and no longer that. I'm the director of reinvestment at Landmarks Illinois. And Landmarks Illinois we're a 50-year-old organization, and we actually started the organization with the loss of the Stock Exchange building in 1971. So I was glad you brought that one up. The programs that I run are our reinvestment program, which is a new program that we've started with loan programs, mostly focused on Chicago's South Side. We have one loan out there now, but hoping to expand that into a statewide program soon. I run our 3 grant programs and our preservation easement program, and we have an easement on this building, so always exciting to be in this building. And Doug asked me to talk about how Landmarks Illinois assess buildings and how we determine what we're going to protect and what we're going to fight for. So I kind of ranked them a little bit on this first one, obviously, Unity Temple. I consider this one an easy one. It's iconic building, Frank Lloyd Wright. It's not just a temple for spiritual temple, but a temple for architectural reflection as well. So really understood by the architectural community. And fortunately for this building, protections were put on early on in the preservation world in the 1960s when preservation protections were first initiated. This building was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1970. UTRF was created in 1973 as the arm to preserve and restore this building. And the preservation easement was put on in the 1980s, which Landmarks Illinois holds to protect both the interior and exterior of the building. So we were part of the restoration, the recent restoration, and we've been part of preserving and protecting this building since the 80s. And most recently, it's a World Heritage Site. Very exciting. So although some of those things don't give it protection, although local landmarking does, the easement and the local landmarking are the only things that truly protect this building. The other designations are honorific. But like I said, this is an easy one. People understand it. They love this building. We're not that scared that this building is going to be damaged in any way. The next ones that I'm showing, I call this the love me or love me nots. The one on the left is Prentice Women's Hospital, designed by Bertram Goldberg in 1975. And unfortunately, we did lose this building. It was not understood by most people, not appreciated for the architecture that it is. Landmarks Illinois has a program called our Endangered Historic Places list, and this building was listed 4 years in a row, starting in 2009. It was in the process of being locally designated when it was demolished. So very tricky situation. We fought long and hard for this building, but people just didn't understand or appreciate this architecture at the time. And currently, one of our big fights right now is for the James R. Thompson Center, which I'm sure you all know as well. Another iconic building. This one built in 1985. Also listed on our endangered list 4 years in a row, starting in 2017. This one has no other protections as well. It's in the process of being listed in the National Register, which, as we know, is just honorific. Although it doesn't offer protections, it does offer incentives. So if it is designated, there would be incentives available for redevelopment of this property, and federal funds would be available to it. But a very challenging one. Both of these buildings are very polarizing. To even within the preservation community, not everyone agrees that the Thompson Center should be saved, and not everybody agreed that the Prentice Women's Hospital should be saved. Looking at a local level, and I know Heidi's going to start crying during this, but the Hill Motor Sales Building, I'm sure you're all familiar with it here in Oak Park. This is another one that Landmarks Illinois was asked to join the community fight on this. And just to say that Landmarks Illinois, we are people saving places for people. So we really try to join where communities are fighting. We will support them in their fight. And this was a long battle for this. It was listed in our endangered list in 2019, and unfortunately we did lose the building. The Historic Preservation Commission did approve the designation of this, but unfortunately they didn't have the backing of the village on this. One of the things that we really look at in a building is how can it be reused. This is a perfect example of there's so many different uses for this building, and one of the things that Landmarks Illinois does is we create reuse studies for buildings to determine the best reuse. It doesn't make sense to use it as a motor sales building anymore, but how can it be used? This is the type of building that we're losing a lot throughout our state, throughout the country. They're not iconic buildings, but they are key features to the community. The loss of this building will really change that stretch of street and in this motor row district in Oak Park. But really the development pressures are coming to construct known prototypes. So it's being replaced by a grocery store that in our eyes they could have reused this building. But they have in their hip pocket a design that they are used to using. And this is our challenge across the state and across the country. Another recent loss here locally is 228 to 230 Madison. And this is one of our challenges now, is the recent past. Landmarks Illinois has partnered with the School of the Art Institute since 2006 to do a recent past survey of suburban Cook County, looking at commercial, institutional, office, and religious buildings, all built between 1935 and 1975. We currently have 1,400 buildings listed on that survey, and this building was one of them. So it's painful to have a loss of our survey. We've currently have 53 communities in suburban Cook County that we've covered, and we're continuing on. And now we have to resurvey because we're losing buildings. So another building type that's just not quite understood by communities, by the public, and it's easier to just tear this down. And I understand it was replaced with a parking lot, which is even more painful. And one thing that we're looking at now to really change our perspective on looking at buildings, we recently created guiding principles. And one of our guiding principles is sustainability, and to directly address how historic preservation relates to climate change. And looking at this building, I don't think anybody would argue that the before picture of this vacant Kmart store in Waukegan is something of great beauty or architectural significance that we need to lay on the mat for and save. But fortunately for us and for Waukegan, the president of the Cristo Rey St. Martin College Prep had a vision for this building. They knew that they needed to move out of their space that was too small for them, and they saw this building that was sitting out very prominently in their community, but vacant, and envisioned reusing that space. And although a lot of people in the preservation world wouldn't even say that this is something that is preservation, this saved this building from going in the landfill. This is now a reused building, and it has really revitalized that community. And to hear the students talk about how their education is impacted by being in this building and saving this building. They have an educational program about sustainability and truly understand how the saving of this building is working within their community. So this is kind of the future of preservation, buildings that we're driving past that we wouldn't say are significant, but they're pieces of our community that need to be preserved. So I just want to thank you again for having me today. And I do want to just call out our address up there of landmarks.org. We are a membership organization, so feel free to click on that and click join or donate. You're always welcome to do that. But thank you very much for having me.
Because it was really very fascinating, so appreciate both of your comments. And I thought I know there may be a few questions on there, but I thought we may kind of start a discussion. Questions I have one of the things that I think is intriguing in comparison of what Suzanne was talking about is some of these buildings of the recent past. And when many of the buildings of the Chicago School were being torn down, especially in the sort of 50s, 60s, that sort of high point, and seeing that graph was pretty dramatic. They were buildings of the recent past. They were 40, in some cases the older ones were 50 years old, but 30, 40, 50 years old. Same ones we're facing now, the Prentice, the Thompson Center, 30, 40, 50 years old. And I've always thought there's not much appreciation for the recent past, no matter what era you're in, right? And I just was curious about your take on that, Richard, and kind of complimenting what Suzanne was saying.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. And if I look at some of those really early buildings that were torn down in 1902, 1911, they were very recent buildings at the time, and no one would have said they were old. So the reasons for tearing them down must not have included it's out of date. Maybe it was. And then even in the 30s, the home insurance building that's a 50-year-old building, so it's not that old a building. Yeah, I guess it's, I guess I'm used to thinking about buildings that are older. So, and it is odd to look at a Thompson Center and thinking about protecting a Thompson Center, which probably replaced something that my father would have liked to protect. And so that sort of works as a strike against something. Do you get to protect it if it replaced that building that Heidi wanted to protect? So in 50 years, someone else might want to protect that.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting as an architectural historian is that many of the Chicago school buildings weren't well thought of by the architectural elite, the Lane Street media of architecture back in
The
the
East
20th
Coast.
century, right? Because they weren't considered beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
They were like factories, vertical factories. They didn't have much ornament. They weren't classical in ornament and style and so forth. And I think maybe the same thing could be said by people of the Merchant Goldberg building, where it's just raw concrete
Mm-hmm.
or a strip mall, right? A Kmart. I mean, Suzanne, you want to maybe comment a little bit on that sort of battle that you face with people who say, well, these buildings aren't architecture, they're not beautiful.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, honestly. And I think part of it is, if something's built within your lifetime, you don't see it as significant or historic. And when I turned 50, I realized, well, I'm historic now, I guess. I'm an antique and things. So, but even, when I think of the 70s and look at 1970s, I have a hard time realizing that at some point I'm probably going to be fighting to save that building. But looking at it now, I don't necessarily appreciate all of it. But then understanding the impacts on community and the impacts on the environment of the loss of that building and how can they be saved is the direction that I would rather think about it. That it may not have such architectural significance, but the impact on community and how it's used and how it can be reused is how we should be looking at that.
Yeah, the example I always give of recent past versus the old is if you think of your parents' wedding photo, right? Most people would look at that and kind of laugh. And they're like, oh, it looks so dumb. Like the goofy hairstyle or the tux or something. But if you look at your grandparents' wedding photo, most people go, wow, that's classic. It's just that extra 20, 30 years of time. And I think when you showed the chart, Richard, of taking them from a 0 point and seeing the decline and survival, it's really striking because there is a dip after about 30 years. And I think there's some reasons that are inherent in architecture and construction, life cycle use after about 50 years. Same is true. I turned 50 and I started to realize all the things that are going wrong with me. But I don't know if you thought about that more of just what precipitates that rapid decline. Because it occurred whether the buildings were hitting the 1960s at the right or wrong time or not.
Yeah, my impression is that the earlier buildings really hit that, aged 40 to 50. And maybe there's reasons that I don't really see that Tom Leslie might know that those designs had an age. I mean, is there an aging factor? It's an interesting question. I see numbers now that 2% per decade. That's what recent commercial buildings in Chicago. I mean, recent when you say 1910, which isn't that recent. And I haven't checked. It'd be interesting to know, buildings built in the 60s and 70s, do they have even higher survival rates? But is there a lifespan that we should expect? And maybe does anyone know what that is? So if you build a building now, are we going to say, well, maybe 200 years, which would be, 2% a decade that's a long lifespan. Half of them are going to be there 300, 400 years. But that, in the recent ones, I don't see any sign of aging. They don't seem to be hitting any And I'm not that familiar with the technology and things that might cause that or not cause it. I'm not sure offhand if buildings, if there should be aging in these structures. Obviously they're replaced. I mean, the old buildings, you know, you say, here's an old building. Well, most of it's been replaced, right, in many cases. But and I guess you can, in principle, you can replace the entire building. I mean, every bit of it could be swapped out in this building and still make it look the same. So that's a different angle. Sometimes I wonder what it means then. You know, if a building is rebuilt from an original plan, they have exactly the same plan, they build exactly the same building. It can look the same, but then we don't think of it as the same building.
Well, and I think interesting example is the Christopher Ray School, in that it's structure that remains, but it's not the same design. So, what was sort of the criteria that was a discussion about, is it preservation of design, or is preservation of building structures?
Yeah, and what I failed to mention in the presentation was that building just recently won a preservation award. It actually won the Legacy Award for Innovation. So how we looked at it was that it was just this windowless box, and the vision that the architect and the school had, and they actually worked a lot with the students of the school in determining what their needs were and what their wants were for the school. How they brought light in, and I didn't include interior photos, but you can look on our website for those. It is the brightest high school I've ever seen. Interior, there's skylights that bring in the daylight, and the back wall is all glass, so it looks onto wetlands behind it. So we really thought that it was innovative, not just in the vision to reuse this building that everyone would agree is not a beautiful building, and the innovation that was put into it to make it not just reused, but reused in such a beautiful, appreciated way.
The last thing I wanted to discuss before we open it up, the chart you showed, the survival chart you showed, was intriguing because you saw this sort of a steady decline, and then you get this sort of post-war 50s, 60s, and this drop, which I think we kind of all expect. And then we know, those of us who are preservationists kind of know that movement starts as a reaction to the massive urban construction building development era. And then you get back to sort of a steady decline. But what was kind of intriguing is preservation. I would think, okay, we get preservation landmarks ordinances and advocacy organizations and so forth, and you should see pretty steady or almost a flat line at that point. But we know it's back. It's not the precipitous decline, but it's a steady decline. It's similar to the pre-1950s, 60s era. And I was sort of intrigued by that because we have this natural thought of, preservation ordinances and so forth are the answer. And I think they're probably helpful, of course, but they're not the full answer. I don't know if you can talk about that or what do you think about how preservation ordinances and landmarking and advocacy, what effect do you think that had on post-1970?
You've just given me ideas, so I'm not know if I'm answering a question.
Oh, good. We'll have you back then.
So it occurs to me that, so it's building turnover, I'd call it. If it's 2% every decade are replaced. But most of the reason for that is not aging buildings anymore. The buildings are perfectly viable and can be maintained. It has to do with, so there's this background turnover that's going to be economic. It's entirely, if you change zoning and you have to get rid of something, things like that. Or someone buys it and they just don't want they want a grocery store. And so I suspect that that turnover that you're asking about would be driven by economic and social decisions. And buildings are, when I see that, they're removing buildings that are perfectly good buildings. They're not, that's not their, there have been buildings torn down because they're not. And I think some of the early ones may have fallen in that category. But, and I'm not sure why, buildings can't, fairly recent buildings, even 50 or more years, can't be built to last really forever, given that parts are going to be replaced. It's not the same structure forever. And that the turnover has to do with decisions that are not structural.
Yeah, I agree that, there's a lot of politics in play with throughout the decades, and the economy plays into it as well. I can't say that, in most places, if you have a preservation ordinance and the backing behind that ordinance, then you'll see the communities. You can tell what communities have ordinances and regulations and zoning versus those that don't. And we're always encouraging communities to have ordinances or have community support in looking at your historic buildings and preserving them. So I would love to see that line just flatline, but I don't know where we're going to see that.
No, he liked Frank Lloyd Wright a lot.
Yeah.
He has lots to say about it.
Yeah, and I'll actually kind of repeat it because the question did not show up on the paper. Your father kind of really seemed to focus on commercial buildings. And this
The book over there?
Right. Maybe some reason for that. Was it something that's regular right, or was it just didn't fit?
It's under the building entry in the index.
I'm glad I brought the book. There was a comment about the survivability of the desire for companies to have a more open floor plan in a modern office environment, and an older, more masonry, low-bearing kind of structure doesn't really allow for that adaptation and use of that. I also kind of have this theory that, many of these early Chicago buildings had a pretty small footprint, and a lot of them were lost as modern buildings got bigger in footprint, and therefore more efficient, and therefore more money for the developers, right? And then in a little quirk, the buildings that did survive had such a small footprint, and they were isolated that nobody wanted to tear them down because there wasn't anything you could build, that would be a moneymaker from the developer standpoint. And so I think maybe some of these 1890s and 1910s buildings survived because they were too small. If they got that far, and then by the 1990s they kind of figured out adaptive reuse strategies like the cheap hotels and apartments and so forth.
He calls the Francis Apartments one of the more distinguished buildings of the last decade. He goes on to describe the flat wall planes and sharp-edged windows some detail. He liked Frank Lloyd Wright a lot, thought he was important. But he didn't do those skyscrapers.
You know, on the same topic we were talking about, you know, you said you thought the Miesian International Modernist buildings were Baucus. I wrote it down here, and what was the quote? Baucus.
Vacuous. He liked calling them vacuous.
And I think that's sort of on the same thing. Like your father didn't think much about
No,
the
it's
recent
true.
past, right?
That's true. But then, you know, it occurs to me that if we had the home insurance building here now, and you have some modern technology, that it could have been. You know, so the Masonic Temple, Tom Leslie told me, well, that building, the elevators work so badly that no one even got to the 21st floor except by climbing up the last 2 or 3 floors on the stairs. So the elevators didn't make it all the way to the top. But, you know, could we have turned that into a viable building now? I suspect the home insurance building could have been turned into a viable building.
Yeah, I think we do have a sort of adaptive strategies for those buildings that would work today before really before the internet. Other than a few boutique offices, there's only so much market for these tiny little quirky office buildings that I think the Sonic building was never torn out because of the subway.
Yeah, often there were, you know, clear development reasons. I mean, the whole, you know, a bunch were torn down when the, you know, the current, you know, the Mies van der Rohe, the county building and the city buildings were built. They tore down whole blocks.
Good questions.
So I wonder, you brought up the Thompson, that's really recent past. Are any surveys being done, really recent? I'm not talking about 1950s, 1960s, but like those that are built in the 1980s, the 90s, and even current buildings. Are there any surveys being done to document?
Yeah, so survey work of buildings that are really recent, you know, 20, 30 years old, like the Thompson building.
Fortunately, no, not yet. You know, in the city of Chicago, there was the Chicago Resource Survey that was done in the 1990s that really focused on buildings that were 50 years old at that time. So it only went up to the 1940s. Then there was a less comprehensive survey done of the recent past in, I want to say the early 2000s, but it was never published. It was never really used. You know, it didn't get expanded. So the recent past survey that Landmarks Illinois is doing with the School of the Art Institute is really the most comprehensive in this area, but it doesn't cover Chicago. It's the Cook County suburban areas, and it really stops in the 1970s. So there hasn't been a survey that goes, you know, into the 80s and 90s. But as things are getting older, they'll need to be included in those surveys. But right now, we would really like to see the City of Chicago survey updated and to include going into the 70s and 80s. Because there was no survey done in the suburban areas, and we felt that that was really where those buildings were, there were pockets of those buildings in those communities that have were not included in any survey at all. I would definitely agree with that. Right now, the city of Chicago, the Historic Preservation Division is understaffed. So taking on a project like that would be very significant. So they just don't have the staffing for it. And they need the incentive to move forward with that. So many buildings just aren't included on the survey that should be. So I would love to see it updated.